So a week ago I came across a video by Gnomonkey called A Plea to Jagex, and the video piqued my interest. It's a video criticizing Jagex, which usually gathers a lot of positive response, but this one had a lot of dislikes. So I'm gonna go through it, and I'm mainly gonna be making sort of a comprehensive response to that video. I mainly have two objectives: number one, to discuss the content of the video, and number two, to just add context that I think the original video sort of lacked, which I think it's important to the overall discussion. Now, you might be asking yourself, cool, who are you to make this video? Like, what are your credentials? And, well, I play both old school and RuneScape 3, and most of my content focuses, well, exactly on discussing the content within both games, how Jagex approaches it, how players interact with it, etc. So at this point I actually spend more time making these videos than I actually spend playing the game. Before I start though, I just want to say I'm not good with video responses, so I will show you part of the video and then just offer general points to try and explain my reasoning for things. I find this to be better since if I were to simply respond to the clips from his video, I would have to stop at every phrase he said to just like correct things. It also makes it way easier to just organize set points if, you know, they're more general. So I would definitely recommend you go and watch the original first, so you don't actually lack any of the context of the things I'm talking about. The link will be in the description. Now, before I start the video, I just want to say that in a lot of my videos, I end up always mentioning good or bad content, or, you know, I state that things are good or bad in certain pieces of content, so I think it's important for us to actually understand them. It's a thing that a lot of people like to talk or like to say when discussing pieces of content. Now, for me, while there are a lot of things that contribute to something being either good or bad, most of it can essentially be boiled down to two major foundations. One, player engagement, aka player enjoyment. Essentially, how engaged players are with your content. Why are they engaged with your content? Is it because it's fun? There's a lot of GP, a lot of XP, are their friends doing it? How many players are doing it? Essentially all of the things that revolve the content itself, the gameplay aspects of the content, if you will. Essentially, if something is fun or not fun, or it has a lot of participation or it doesn't have a lot of participation. Obviously, some things can have a lot of participation and not be all that fun. Some things can be really fun but not have a lot of participation, so you can obviously mix and match, and this is important to understand for us to then go into the gameplay side of things and understand, okay, why is this working, why is this not working, is this desirable or not. The second major foundation is the health of the game. Obviously, stuff like balancing issues, the short-term and long-term gameplay problems that a content might have, but also the context for content to exist in the game. Let me give you a very quick example of that. Trees are found all over Gielinor. Now, the vast majority of trees, they are not used for gameplay purposes. They are bad gameplay. They don't have a lot of people cutting them. They are not very good training methods. They are also not very fun to cut because they are way out of the way. However, they are still important for the game, specifically because they act as set dressing, they act for the immersion of the game, the world building, right? So, just because something might not necessarily be good gameplay doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad piece of content. Obviously, to give another example, and when you put things side by side, something can be really fun and have a lot of participation and be bad for the game. That Twisted Bow spawning in the farming guild definitely was a lot of fun for a lot of players because they have a endgame weapon. It had a lot of people trying to pick it up, but obviously it was incredibly bad for the overall health of the game. So it's really all a balancing act. Also, it's obviously worth noting that fun is very subjective.
When someone mentions high-level content, HLC, or demanding gameplay, they're referring to pieces of content with mechanical depth, such as the Inferno, Chambers of Xeric, and the Theater of Blood. These updates have held considerable significance in the speedrunning community and offer highly coveted rewards such as kits and the Infernal Cape, or just outright good GP. I've seen misconceptions crop up among both Jagex and the low to mid-level player base when they mistakenly label encounters like the Tombs of Amasket, Desert Treasure 2 bosses, Corrupted Gauntlet, Muzpa, Nightmare, even her harder variant Fasani, Nex, and Fight Caves as high-level, difficult, or even impossible. In reality, these encounters require minimal practice and involve straightforward mechanics. failing to provide us with substantial content to engage with, learn from, and truly challenge ourselves.
Now, I think that this can essentially just be boiled down to Jagex misunderstands high-level content, because Gnomonkey perceives high-level content as almost a very skilled activity and almost all determined by skill. This would be akin to, for example, playing League of Legends and being a challenger player, yet some people saying that you aren't high level. Yet, technically you aren't, because the most skilled players aren't challenger players, they are pro players, the people that play at the top teams and top leagues. However, the way the rest of the community and how, in this case, Jagex, or in that case would be Riot, views you, they view you as an high-level player. Despite not being in the leagues of the best, that doesn't mean it's not high-level. Gnomonkey completely misunderstands that mechanically challenging content is not necessarily high-level content. High-level content simply as a barrier of entry, be it the mechanics, the levels, or the gear. This is important for Jagex to differentiate, as not every high-level content they put out needs to be inherently challenging or difficult. It can just require a lot of Grandmaster quests, for example, it can require high levels or high gear. Gnomonkey is also obviously biased. The more skill and experience you have at the game, the less difficult you find content that comes out to be. Chambers of Xeric and TOB coming out today would most likely not be perceived as challenging due to all of the knowledge and experience that we accumulated over the years. However, that does not transfer for every players, especially players that are just coming into the game. So while we might perceive them as less difficult, for newer players it might not be so. Another point that is important to bring up when it comes to the need of challenging content in the game is that challenging content also requires good rewards. As not having good rewards, there's no reason for people then to do the challenging content. The problem is, the good rewards increase the overall power creep of the game, and too many rewards will inevitably lead to power creep taking over the game. As a result, Jagex needs to balance the challenge with the reward. So if you keep asking for super hard content, obviously Jagex would have to implement super OP rewards to keep up with it and make up for it. It's a simple design philosophy. This, however, would just ruin the game faster. And again, if we simply don't have good rewards, even if a piece of content is challenging, then most players would just not do it. Another thing to touch here is simply that the old school combat system also is far more limiting in what Jagex can do with it and its mechanics and how complex it can actually be. Ironically enough, this is why RuneScape 3 got TOC, and also Jagex doesn't want to make content that is impossible to do. Challenging content should always be completable by the more casual players. Inferno, for example, is perceived as really hard simply due to players not wanting to spend the time learning it due to the rewards being just a barely better cape than the one they already have. It's mostly just for the flex or the achievement. However, I would actually wager that the vast majority of the community could actually do it if they were just given enough time to do it, even if you lock the current gear available, so you wouldn't have any power creep. No dev actually wants to make content that players simply either can't do or they can't enjoy. And lastly, and I think that this is a very important point for the conversation, engaging or challenging mechanics are very subjective and depend heavily on players' experiences. For example, certain players find being precise through a short period of time far harder than being consistent through a long period of time, and vice versa. Obviously, players will also have different tastes of the things that not only they find challenging, but the things they like to do and the things that they don't like to do. In a general rule, the thing that they don't like to do is the thing that they struggle the most with. So in this part, he essentially just makes a timeline of the updates that came into the game from 2016 to 2023. I'm not gonna go over everything he said, it's like a 5-minute segment. However, I do want to point out some things here specifically. First of all, it does seem to say that the golden years were earlier on, in 2017-18 specifically, which was when we were just worse at the game, so maybe that's why he enjoyed it most. He also says that 2020 is when the content started going downhill. But he never explains that the reason might be purely because of the pandemic. That simply was a sudden change to a lot of people, that as a result it was reflected in the quality of the content that came out that year, or at least in the amount of content that came out that year. It's a pretty important context clue to leave out. Combat achievements, mainly being unique challenges, is exactly what they were meant to be. They were meant to be the equivalent of achievement diaries, but for combat. And in my opinion, the biggest problem with them is exactly the lack of more interesting you do it once achievements. However, all of this ties to an earlier point, which is Jagex wants to make challenging content, but not only 1% of the player base can complete this content. Again, it needs to be accessible to the rest of the player base, that's why most of the combat achievements were more fun than necessarily challenging per se. Obviously, they do have some problems and I will make a video later on, but just to point that out.
Major updates beyond this included things like quest speedrunning and the PvP arena, both of which are completely dead. There are 11 people in quest speedrunning worlds as I look at them writing the script.
So, given his reaction, I'm gonna go out on a limb and essentially say that he doesn't really appreciate that content in the game. And it's fair, a lot of people don't. However, I want to touch specifically on the PvP arena and speedrunning worlds, because them being that content, I think it's a bit of a cop-out, and I think that a lot of people don't actually understand the impact that both of those updates had in the game, and the overall points of them. The PvP arena came to substitute the dual arena, which was an hotbed for real-world trading and gambling, so something not being as engaging doesn't mean it was necessarily a bad update. Also, he only showed an Aussie world. The PvP arena for the US and the UK worlds actually have a combined 60 players. Which, sure, while not super popular, LMS also suffered from popularity problems for years, being popular on release and then sort of dropping off, and now it's popular again. So something not being popular on release doesn't mean that Jagex can't improve it and become popular in the years after. The permanent Deadman mode worlds gets less than 50 concurrent players. Jagex still sometimes does quality of life updates here and there, but the more important thing about them having only 50 concurrent players is the fact that they were still an important update for us in order to get Deadman mode seasonal. So the fact that they don't have a lot of concurrent players right now doesn't necessarily mean that the update is quote-unquote bad. Speedrunning worlds being dead content is a very ironic thing to complain about. Most of the PvM high-level discussion that he was having was surrounded by mechanics either being engaging or fun, or not engaging and not fun, which is subjective, and how people love to speedrun prestigious pieces of content such as the Inferno and the Chambers of Xeric, which he said he loves doing solo CMs. So complaining that a niche is that content when your niche is part of it, it's a pretty weird thing to do. Overall, however, and the more important thing about both of these updates is that, despite them being dead content, they do showcase that Jagex does listen to the niches in the community and offers content to them. They also ensure long-term interest in the game by providing different ways of engaging with it, the same way that Ultimate Iron Man did, where it wasn't that popular when it came out, especially due to difficulty, and nowadays, while not being the most popular content in the game, you see far more of them. One of the main points he makes is that he is not being listened to because high-level players are a niche, and, he says that, oh, but we matter. And he is right, you do matter. But why are you then trashing other pieces of content that are niche as being bad because they are dead? A lot of players don't spend 24/7 speedrunning quests. That doesn't mean no players paid attention to it. Plenty of players did it for the rewards, which is still a success. Content doesn't need to be popular 24/7 to be good for the health of the game. Same reason why PvP Arena was good for the game, because it removed an hotspot for real-world trading despite lacking popularity, which again can be changed in the future as with investment it can become popular. It is incredibly short-sighted to complain about not being listened to by making a 30-minute long video and then trash another niche because not enough players equals that content, which tries to say Jagex wastes time with useless content instead of just, listening to players like him.
The endgame player base has been completely ignored in cries for QoL. Many of the speedruns we do are hampered by things that could be fixed very easily. CMs require I swap my spellbook with my max cape right after Ice Demon. 6 minutes into the 30-minute raid. That means I get to complete a maximum of 5 CMs per day. Top speedruns use the same thing at Sodatseg, meaning you have a pool of 5 TOB and CM speedruns you can do each day. This could easily be given a recharge of some kind, either syncing items or resources to recharge your swaps, perhaps lowering the total amount to 1 or 2 swaps, so you can't be swapping constantly at every activity. Falador Shield and Explorer's Ring charges are also relevant. Falador Shield is worth 1.5 restores in 1 inventory slot, meaning it is practically required to complete an Inferno speedrun. Yes, the prayer points are that tight. Once you use your shield for the day, you might as well stop running. Explorer's Ring charges are used in many setups for additional run energy, but these are limited to 1 run per day as well. These both could be rechargeable in some way to fix this. Inferno speedruns require a Slayer task to run, meaning in order to run Inferno, you need to get a task somehow. The fastest and most efficient method the community has fallen on is Turiel canceling to get a task from Neve, who has the highest weight for Inferno tasks. Even with an optimized block list and unlocks and efficient Turiel setup, you're looking at about 30 minutes on average to get a Zuck task. Sometimes you get unlucky and can go as dry as 4+ hours without a task. If you have a Zuck helmet, you can get 3 attempts per task, but that's still 30 minutes on average per 3 attempts, which can be rinsed incredibly quickly. My solution to this would simply give the Jad Challenge Master the ability to assign you Tizhar tasks after completing 6 Jad once. This would be a separate task streak like Krystilia, and not reward any Slayer points or XP. It would simply be used for the Slayer helmet bonus within Inferno, or fight caves, allowing speedrunners to run without being forced to kill goblins and cows.
So the main issue here is with the time-gated issue with speedruns, with the limited spellbook swap and Explorer's Ring and the Falador Shield and everything. This could be easily solved with like some sort of system where you could just, I don't know, reset it, and like maybe even, you know, where you're just given the gear that you need to speedrun so everyone has the same setup, you know, so everyone goes from the same point. Like maybe we can call it something like a time trial world. Actually no, I have an idea. Speedrunning world. Yeah, you know, the thing they just spent the fucking past trash talking, or at least, you know, not being too favorable because, oh, speedrunning world's dead content, right? Where these type of things could be very easily solvable if you just had a speedrunning world for it. Also, speedrunning isn't speedrunning when the only people being able to do it are the ones that can afford it. From all the speedrunning communities I accompany, many steps are made to ensure that people have a level-headed playing field, doing things like removing load times or even using emulators because copies have become way rare and way too expensive. So, you know, everything that only really matters when it comes to the speedruns is the skill itself. And him talking about needing a task in order to speedrun Inferno, again, you actually don't need a task to speedrun Inferno. You could easily have a separate category for it on, you know, for task and on task or off task. These distinctions are something that, again, other speedrunning communities have already dealt with, and they simply get together and decide if X thing is allowed, or simply create a different category altogether. These again, however, could be just solved with a speedrunning world. Honestly, I think that overall, his solutions seem way too convoluted for being in the main game. You could, again, just have a speedrunning world.
Forestry is woodcutting but with random events. It turned every main tree in the game into Motherlode Mine timed resource nodes, including redwoods for some reason. With incredibly high XP rates. The random events are as simple as clicking a log on the ground repeatedly. They simply add a huge chunk of XP for players willing to interact with them. The only draw to Forestry is the ability to do it with a large group of people.
Right, so rather than going point by point, let me just explain what Forestry is and why it works. Forestry is part of Jagex's effort to modernize how players interact with skilling. I've in fact made a video about how Jagex is changing the way we do skilling or something like that a couple of months ago. Simply put, resource competition just isn't the most exciting or fun thing about the game. On top of that, a lot of gathering skills don't really offer much outside of resources that are already devalued due to the high volume that comes from PvM. Forestry then comes in to solve both of these issues. The issue with resource competition, especially when bots are involved, is that players will suffer for it. They have to sacrifice XP rates and GP rates because they are competing with other players, which overall just makes it way harder for not only players to enjoy, but also for Jagex to balance it due to the lack of proper and consistent information on the methods. Previously, if you cut a log, the tree would have a chance of being cut down, which means more players, higher chances of being cut down, and as a result more player animosity, if you will. Instead, this update rewards players for coming together and participating in activities, which is something that Jagex has been pushing on for years at this point, especially in RuneScape 3. This is because now the timer of a tree being cut down is down to an average time, and it increases with more players cutting down the tree, where you get a wood cutting bonus. So more players cutting the same tree doesn't mean worse XP rates or GP rates for you. It is simply way easier to balance, it's way easier to develop content for it, and is also much better content to enjoy because it's sociable. Ultimately, this is a multiplayer game, and bringing players together, in this case through skilling, is a great way to not only reforge some of the good old days of, asking with getting levels in, the Willows at Drainer and seeing a level 3 getting killed by the Dark Wizard. This also, sort of dispels some of the, oh, this game is dead, blah blah blah, because you do actually see a lot of players in certain areas, which, contributes to that social aspect of the game. As for the random events, that is simply an extra incentive to pay attention while woodcutting. RuneScape 3 does this with the faster progress on rocks if you click on the glowing one. It's essentially a reward for paying attention, but not a punishment for not paying attention, and it just benefits everyone. It's basically a positive versus negative way of looking at things. In one, if you don't pay attention, you just have a lack of more reward, while in the other, if you don't pay attention, you actually get withheld the reward. So, with the random events, if you don't pay attention, you still get the woodcutting XP, you just miss out on very good XP and extra reward. But, with the old system, if you don't pay attention, the tree gets cut down, you don't click on it fast enough, and as a result, your XP rates get to the fucking gutter. It's simply two different design philosophies. So given this, it is a mistake to say that this update didn't actually add anything. It is a crucial step on how we do skilling, while also adding some neat woodcutting related rewards, which follows and enforces the philosophy of rewarding players for doing content they already are doing with more content. Sort of like how quests don't just give you XP, but they usually give you more activities, like a new boss or a new skilling method or just a new area for you to train.
Increased XP makes you feel good as a player, but this update didn't add anything substantial gameplay-wise. Forestry worlds are still near full to this day. I'm not sure if this is mostly bots or if players are truly enjoying this update. I find it lazy, weak, and unnecessary. Woodcutting already has plenty of varied and interesting training methods. 2-tick and AFK teaks were both great. Suliaceps, redwoods, yews, and blisterwood are all good ways of training with varying levels of intensity. This update has basically removed any reason to do Suliaceps, as any forestry tree will be the same or more XP per hour. This update simply rains XP down on everybody without adding anything substantial to the skill.
For years, players have said that they simply don't like the resource competition of skilling, and while yes, we do have different training methods, Forestry mostly impacted the most popular one, aka people AFKing at different types of trees. The vast majority of people simply does not find tick manipulation methods all that engaging, and just because there are different training methods, this should not stop Jagex from fixing the problems that some of those methods have. This mentality is lazy, weak, and unnecessary.
RS3 receives update after update for their endgame PvM, and the best players in old school are left kicking sand. RS3 has loads of non-raid endgame PvM. There are 3 mini-raids tied into dungeoneering called Elite Dungeons. These are Diablo-esque dungeons with mobs and bosses throughout, usually 2 smaller bosses ending with a huge final boss. There are multiple difficult endgame raid bosses. The only thing OSRS has like this is Nex and Nightmare. They have Calfight King, Virago, Barrow's Rise of the Six, Solak. They even relatively recently added Zamorak as a massive raid boss. They have tons of extremely difficult solo bosses, including Araxor, Zuck, Archglacior, and my favorite, Telos.
So, it is true that RuneScape 3 does get way more PvM challenges and bosses. However, this is due to two very important reasons. Number one, the game has predominantly high level players which like PvM and like to focus on it. Jagex, as a result, appeals to them. Number two, there's no polling. As a result of the lack of polling, this just means that Jagex doesn't need to delay any update or scrap any rewards because they just, well, design them and put them in the game. There's no drawback, there's no not passing the poll. Now, while these are the major factors, they are not the only ones. First of all, RuneScape 3 also benefits from EOC, Evolution of Combat, which simply gives a lot of bosses deeper mechanics. A lot of the bosses that were mentioned by Gnomonkey aren't exactly hard when it comes to the point-and-click nature of them or interesting. They are mostly interested in how they engage when it comes to your EOC abilities. These means that Jagex can play around with a lot more mechanics to make bosses engaging rather than just having to rely purely on a point-and-click system. Also, RuneScape 3 has simply far more room for rewards, from ability codexes to certain gear that interacts with certain abilities, to books that have different effects, different prayers, upgrades to other pieces of gear. This ties into the, challenging equals rewards, which RuneScape 3 can do because they have a lot of reward space. Therefore, RuneScape 3 can have a lot of bosses without worrying too much about power creep due to the wider variety of boss reward types. Also, without wanting to necessarily be petty here, but Araxxor isn't exactly what most players nowadays would consider extremely hard. Yeah, they are still a nice challenge for those getting into PvM, but I would put it more on the level of Zulrah when it comes to being a PvM noob gate than necessarily Telos or Zuck, especially if we are talking about 0% enrage.
Telos has a risk mechanic where you can leave the loot you've received in the chest and do another kill, increasing your loot modifier but risking the loot left inside. Also getting more difficult each kill, up to 4,000%. Archglacior has the same enrage meter to keep the difficulty increasing.
Which, speaking of enraged mechanics, let's actually talk about them. Enraged mechanics were introduced as a way to prevent people from grinding bosses on release way too hard, and as a result sort of preserve part of the drops and the value of them. This was first introduced with Araxxor back in 2013. Later, it was expanded to be an actual challenge to players. This was expanded 3 years later, I think in 2016, with actual Telos. Worth noting though that at Araxxor, the enrage only makes the boss harder, it does not increase the likelihood of rewards other than the pet, I'm pretty sure. It is important to note, however, that while the streak and enrage percent does affect the likelihood or the amount of loot you get, they don't actually add any new mechanics to the boss fights in most cases. As far as I know, they only alter them slightly at points, and even then it's pretty rare for them to do so, or in the case of Telos, you get a 5th phase past 100%, but no more phases after that until, well, not until, even at 4000% you don't get any newer phases. What Enrage does, however, in general, is that it increases the damage the boss deals to you, and at Archglacior it also increases its HP. While you can try this mechanic in old school RuneScape, I doubt it would be much deeper. You already do bosses with in-game gear, and this wouldn't make you change the gear that you do the bosses in. In RuneScape 3, however, due to EOC, Invention, and all of the PvM gear available to you, beating an enrage percentage boss becomes a game of getting good enough RNG, while also making sure they can survive and sustain through the boss's attack increase. On top of that, while it does provide a challenge, people have also figured out the most optimal enrage percent to farm certain bosses and certain drops, which sort of defeats the purpose of making them more challenging, since you can actually pick the percentage you can actually start your streak with. Also, in all of these, RNG is a massive factor. And one thing to cap out this section, since protection prayers don't actually protect 100% of the damage in RuneScape 3, oftentimes people end up flicking Soul Split and protection prayer to negate some of the damage at higher enrages, while also making it able to heal, so it makes the overall kill far more viable. Old school RuneScape prayers would defeat the purpose of enrages because you always negate 100% of the damage. Therefore, the enrage increasing damage does nothing at all. I guess the streak mechanic could be fun, especially to try at certain streak bosses without dying, But again, in terms of actual challenge, I doubt that it would actually change too much with the current mechanics that old school RuneScape has. I think that the increase in damage would actually not be an insignificant increase in challenge. In this section, he mainly just mentions a bunch of bugs that happen, or some of them are still in the game. Now here's the thing. No one likes bugs, not even the developers. I also find it funny that prior he complained about RuneScape 3 getting way more PvM updates. Ironically enough though, RuneScape 3 also gets way more bugs than old school does. But let's face it, the longer a game goes, the more bugs a game will have. This is simply true for every single online game out there that has been running for a decent amount of times. While yes, Jagex could have more robust QA, it is also impossible to have as many people testing your content as the amount of players that play it when it comes out. It's understandable, players feel frustrated, especially when bugs ruin the game for people. However, it is also disingenuous to not point to the fact that Jagex also does a very good job at fixing a lot of the bugs that are reported and presented to them. Focusing on bugs coming out on an online game that has updates once a week that has been running for over 10 years is the same as complaining that when it rains, you get wet. It's just a statistical inevitability. That, however, should not detract from the times that Jagex does release plenty of fixes, and it's worse to spend your time complaining about Jagex not fixing bugs than simply presenting them to them for them to fix. It's also worth pointing out that as things evolve, so do the people working at Jagex and the coding techniques that they use, the decisions they make on how they handle technological progress, which overall just adds further into the pile of mess that is online gaming code. I feel players nowadays focus so much on the negatives of an update, especially when it comes to bugs because of how burned they are with other AAA releases, that, you know, that is all anyone talks about anymore nowadays. And I feel that overall this detracts from the content that was already just released. I'm not trying to justify it necessarily, but giving context to it is important while also understanding that while yes, there are a lot of bugs, not every bug is game breaking. Now of course, if a bug is game breaking, please do report it to Jagex and actually present it to them so they can fix it.
I was so incredibly hopeful for TOA. It had been 4 years since TOB and everyone was incredibly thirsty for content. Scaling invocations, this is their chance to add something for the entire player base. Something truly challenging for the veterans should they want it, and something accessible for people to get into. And then TOA came out. And for that first week, I was still hopeful. This is an amazing base, they just need to clean it up a little bit. Instead, what we got is the mid-level raid. The raid not for us. The raid for people getting into raids only. Raising raid level doesn't make things harder or more interesting, it makes them hit harder and have more defense. It doesn't add mechanical depth, it makes the raid take longer. And that's it.
Except it literally does. It adds mechanics to the bosses and changes some of the mechanics they already have. Also, the HP, attack and defense percentage of the bosses increasing with the level is exactly what Enraged does. The higher Enrage, the more damage that the boss does. So if we already have a sort of enraged mechanic in old school RuneScape, it clearly didn't make Gnomonkey happy, so we can just skip introducing another one for him to try it out because we already know it doesn't like it. Also, the raid is supposed to be approachable to multiple levels. The, enrage, I guess, and scaling simply goes both ways towards being easier and also harder rather than just the basic from, ground to harder. I feel Gnomonkey wanted a raid where the base level was like level 250 and then the invocations would simply make it higher and make it harder, as opposed of the base being 150, but you are also able to make it easier rather than just harder. Overall though, at this point I was like 3.5 hours into the video trying to essentially untangle what he said, and he also doesn't put any section breaks, so he just rapid fires all of the stuff that he's talking about. And overall it's just really hard to try and compile a list of like general responses without going phrase by phrase, and it's kind of tiring. Now, overall, the rest of the video, the rest of TOA and Desert Treasure 2 specifically, most of the things I would just be repeating myself, where, you know, bosses aren't too engaging, they're not challenging, blah blah blah. It's pretty much the same thing. I would have to repeat myself with the, you know, challenging content also requires good reward, Jagex doesn't want to have too much power creep, etc, etc, etc. Now, I think it is worth noting, because since I'm gonna essentially gloss over Desert Treasure 2, that he did enjoy the Horde mode of Leviathan. He actually did praise the boss fight a lot and said that he really liked it. I think that is, you know, worth pointing out, because I don't want to make it seem like he was all negative and didn't have any praise towards it.
I've been collecting feedback from anyone willing to provide it in my Discord. The questions I asked were, are you happy with the state of the game? If you could make change, what would be your priority? What makes the game fun for you? And what makes the game unenjoyable for you? I've gotten some amazing feedback from players of all different skill levels and backgrounds.
Now, on this section, I actually don't want to talk about the specific feedback of the players, as in just people's opinions, regardless of them being accurate or not. However, I do want to mention this, because he did say that he gathered feedback, and that he gathered feedback from all types of players across all skill levels. And I would have to disagree with that, since most of his feedback, as you can see in this section, came from his own Discord. His own Discord is gonna have people that like him and his content. He's a high level player, so most of his Discord is gonna be filled with people that are already good at the game, that are around his skill level, people that are aspiring to be at that skill level, or people that simply like to watch that skill level. Obviously, this means that people will inherently be biased to like his content and like his view of the game. As a result, this makes it feel like your voices aren't being heard because of how we feel about the game, when in reality, this simply isn't representative of the community at large, and it is disingenuous to pass it as if it is. Now, before I actually just end the video, I do want to touch on some points throughout that I couldn't touch on throughout the video, or at least they're just better to have here than to have in other points of the video. But essentially, obviously the representing all sides of the community or whatever is bullshit, since most of his feedback came from this Discord, and looking at the video, clearly that's not how the community felt. And honestly, I think it would be better off just asking on Reddit or some other more neutral place. Sure, Reddit doesn't exactly have the most, accurate complaints, as usually they knee-jerk reaction to hate on Jagex. However, at least the range of responses would have been definitely more diverse over what people actually enjoy in the game or what they think the problems with it are, etc, etc. Another thing that I want to touch on is, for someone who has 500 days on old school RuneScape, he said that he had similar amount in RuneScape 3. However, when he was answering the popular question of, well, if RuneScape 3 bosses are so engaging and challenging in terms of mechanics, why don't you just play RuneScape 3? He responds that there are a lot of factors that he doesn't like about RuneScape 3, stuff like dailies and MTX, for example, which is fair. Yet, in the end, when he actually talks about his playtime in RuneScape 3, he makes it feel like his RuneScape 3 playtime is actually recent and that he has experience with recent bosses. So why not just respond that you already occasionally play RuneScape 3? It seems to me like he used to play it years and years ago, but not ever since he started old school RuneScape, which is overall kind of weird and made me raise an eyebrow, but nothing to, I guess raise red flags over. He also mentions that he misses big releases like the Inferno with thousands of players watching and etc, but I think it's important to state, just like with, Baldur's Gate 3, these are the outliers. They are not the norm and they should not be the norm. And even then, on that note, we still do have hype releases. We have Deadman Mode, for example, or Leagues, or Group Iron Man, which took over Twitch because Jagex tried to push hard for it. So we still do get a decent amount of updates that have a huge hype. Is it as hype as it was back then? No, but a lot of things also changed since then, and you can't exactly reproduce every update being hype, and that is not always the fault of the update. And honestly, if every update is gonna be hype, no update is hype. He also mentioned somewhere about his high-level players, about his friends that are high-level players quitting, and he talks about it as if it's a bad thing, but personally, I think it's fine for players to take a break from the game, go play something else, come back once you feel like it, it's just overall healthier, not just for you, but also for the game. And in terms of like the lack of challenge that he mentions a lot throughout the video, because no challenging updates or whatever, if there's anything that speedrunning has taught me is that the biggest challenges are the ones you impose to yourself. If you truly want to do more challenging content, start being creative, start going out of your way and handicapping yourself. During the Tula session that I actually didn't go into too much, but at some point he mentions how the Red X method for Baba was the only method viable and it was removed, and that even, you know, went to follow the riot or whatever. And to me it's really weird if you truly want to challenge yourself, because if the Red X method was so boring or whatever to do, this then should come as a sign for you to, well, find a new way to do Baba and take on that challenge, rather than just complaining that the method that was already bad to do Baba with because it was boring and not engaging got removed. At the end of the day, a game can only provide as much content as you are willing to play. So if you're not willing to challenge yourself, the game can't provide a challenge to you either. I was also pretty disappointed with the lack of solutions displayed here. Caring about the game is one thing, having an opinion is another, and offering solutions is another. Caring for content isn't easy, but I would have loved to see some more solutions other than just, I just want more engaging bosses, without him, you know, actually trying to understand why Jagex doesn't do them more often, or at least explaining thoroughly what the mechanics that are engaging to him are. He said that Chambers or TOB is his favorite content, right, and whatnot, but he never really explained specifically why that is. Is it because it requires a lot of precision? Is it because it requires a lot of consistency? There's a lot of multitasking? Like, what specific mechanics do you find engaging? You could have explained that a little bit better, rather than just saying that a lot of new content is bad because it's not engaging, Toa was disappointing because it's not engaging, it's all boring, there's no room for improvement. But then you don't explain how TOB has room for improvement, how Chambers has room for improvement. So I would have loved to see more, explanation there. But overall, and let's actually address the main point of the video. Why did he get this response? I mean, obviously, aside the fact that, you know, he wasn't all that right with the stuff he talked about, he also attacked a lot of content that people enjoyed without giving a lot of reason for it. Ultimately, I think that the reason as to why he got such a huge pushback was because he sounded incredibly out of touch, like incredibly so. I think he cares way too much about every single detail of the game, as opposed to just having fun with it. And honestly, I think that the video would have been better received if he simply stated what he wanted to see changed, as opposed to try to drag other updates down by being bad or whatever. Obviously, I think that his Discord gave him a false sense of security, you know, when he was saying that, he talked with the rest of the community, without bothering to actually try and perceive stuff from a more mid-level perspective, for example, right? The game being bad is a story as old as time. People back in 2016 were saying the same about the updates that were coming out then. This is nothing new. And honestly, when talking about content, you need to try and understand the dev's design for it and how players like to interact with it. This is something that he clearly didn't do, which is why he sounded so much out of touch, which then was again obviously supported by the feedback that I got on this Discord, thinking that everyone in the community thinks like that. This video, in my opinion, is the perfect proof of what happens when you focus so much on a specific aspect of the game. You feel like every little change matters, the time between updates feels longer than it actually is, and you are not able to look past your own nostalgia for when you struggled. The nostalgia you had when you simply weren't as good at the game, when stuff actually felt more challenging. I get it, but making a video trying to make it seem like it's Jagex's fault that you simply reached the ceiling, it's just a mistake. You did it. You completed the game, or at least part of it. You can go and play something else, or simply try other content in the game, which there are still plenty of. But this video just wasn't the right decision.